So Americans in the world did know that something huge and insane and something that totally new in the history of warfare had been used in Hiroshima. What they really didn't know was the extent to which this is the bomb that kept on killing long after detonation.
Lesley M.M. Blume is an award-winning journalist and New York Times best-selling author. Her book Fallout tells the story of how American war correspondent John Hersey helped expose the deadliest government cover-up of the 20th century, the true effects of the nuclear bombs detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the Sperber Prize podcast, a show where I'll talk to winners and nominees of the annual award given by Fordham University in honor of author Anne M. Sperber and her remarkable biography of Edward R. Murrow. The Sperber Prize seeks to promote outstanding biographies and memoirs detailing the unseen backgrounds to some of history's biggest stories in print and electronic journalism. I'm your host, Kevin Deneen. Joining me today is award-winning journalist, historian, and New York Times best-selling author, Lesley M.M. Blume. She is also the author of Sperber Prize winner Fallout, the Hiroshima Cover-up, and the reporter who revealed it to the world. Lesley, how are you doing today?
I'm okay, considering.
All things considered.
Yes.
So let's get just right into the background of the book a little bit and why you wanted to write it. So can you just give a little overview, what it's about, and what really drew you to it?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it might seem ironic given everything that's happening right now in, the current nuclear landscape, but I originally did not come at the book through the nuclear angle. Initially, I came at it through the journalism angle because it was, in 2015 and 2016 that I was trying to figure out what my next book was going to be. And this also coincided with the rise of Trump and, just in the lead up to the 2016 election. And we were seeing these, what then felt like shocking and unprecedented attacks on the American press. And, I'm from a press background. I grew up in a newsroom, literally, partly grew up in a newsroom. My dad was Walter Cronkite's producer and writer. And, I went into newsrooms when I was still in college for internships. And, I married a journalist. Journalism world is my world. And journalists are my tribe. And it was so horrible to see these designations of our free press and our journalists as, quote, enemies of the people. I mean, what is this Stalinist language being directed at the press corps by this insane presidential candidate, a failed talk show host? And I mean, it was just, and so it was a rallying cry for me, Fallout, to help remind readers of the power and the unbelievably crucial importance of our free press and what was at stake in protecting the free press from this onslaught from within.
Your book goes into John Hersey's story, which sort of uncovered the truth of what happened at Hiroshima because the government had been sort of hiding it up to that point.
Not sort of. I mean, like very emphatically with enormous effort covering up the true nature of the radioactive fallout in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for that matter, the Trinity test site in New Mexico.
The bomb was dropped August 6th, 1945. Over a year later, Hersey's story comes out. What was the American perception before his story was released?
Well, it's interesting because I call the story of the bombing of Hiroshima and then to a slightly lesser extent, Nagasaki, the most covered story of the war, but also the most covered up, because it wasn't a secret that the Americans had dropped this then experimental mega weapon on Hiroshima. I mean, President Harry Truman announced it, with great fanfare, actually. This was a bomb that was a new thing, and it harnessed the powers of the sun. I mean, there was like this biblical language that he used to describe it, and it's the equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. I mean, which was like unheard of at the time. And so Americans in the world did know that something huge and insane and something that totally new in the history of warfare had been used in Hiroshima. But what they really didn't know was the extent to which this is the bomb that kept on killing long after detonation. And, to be fair, a lot of the scientists who helped create the bomb didn't really understand the true nature of the bomb that they had created. But, it became very quickly obvious that the effects of radiation were killing people for days and weeks and months and years after the bombs had dropped. And the US was not particularly jazzed to have the rest of the world find out that this is how they ended their morally righteous war. They completely compromised the moral high ground of their victory against vicious enemies. And not only that, they're about to put tens of thousands of American and Allied troops into occupied Japan, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that's not a good look, right? So they sent a team in and, they cleared the atomic cities very quickly. You could live there forever. General Lesley Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, said, "In go the troops." Also quietly in go, a small fleet of American scientists and military figures to start studying Japanese victims of the bombing so they can see they can start to really understand for the first time the true effects of the radioactive qualities of their bombs. And they're studying these guys for years afterwards. So the Japanese victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki really were essentially guinea pigs.
Obviously, coverage along the way. You said it was like the most covered story in history, but not covered in the right way initially. Yeah. What did it look like for the Japanese and American press that was there before Hersey came?
First of all, it depends on when you got there. The Japanese press knew fast after Hiroshima and Nagasaki that this was something new under the sun and completely horrific. And they were ironically actually restricted from reporting on it at first by their own government. Because they hadn't surrendered yet. They made it sound like it was just more firebombing, which had already decimated more than 60 cities in Japan. But then, initial reports came out. And so first there was a Japanese-American reporter who got into Hiroshima. His mom had lived there. He went to try to find her. He was shocked by what he saw. I mean, it was a city of 300,000 people that had been completely eviscerated. It looked like an ashtray, he said. He had found his mom and she had been on the outskirts of the city, miraculously had survived. But, he had managed to get a report to AP out about, the devastated city. And so, Associated Press, it's a wire service. And so it runs in newspapers across America and around the world. He pulled no punches also. He really laid out the devastation. And he said that there was a sinister, like they thought it was gas at that point. They didn't understand, that it was radiation. He said that something sinister was killing off survivors. Interestingly, as American publications, including the New York Times, only read an abbreviated version of that and omitted references to the radioactive after effects. Another reporter got in, one of my favorites, Wilfred Burchett. He was this incredibly scrappy war correspondent, Australian, and he got out a mega report that ran in the London Express that said, this is the atomic plague. So that ran in full around the world. And then after that, reporters who had gotten into Nagasaki and Hiroshima, their reports were intercepted. The cities were made restricted areas by the occupying forces, which took over very quickly. And after that point, after those two very damaging initial reports, which again took place in within 30 days of the bombings, after those damaging reports, the press clamped down on both the Japanese press and the American press was near total.
Was it because the government was sort of trying to just maintain their image?
I think it was a combination of factors. As we said, one of the former Secretary of War had said, we don't want to be seen as having outdone Hitler in atrocities. And he was already referring to just the firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. This was even before, they knocked out Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. So that was already a concern that was really in the minds of American military and political leaders. And again, we have our allied troops very much on the ground in these places. I mean, there were thousands of American soldiers who were based in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In some cases, right near ground zero of the respective bombings. And, soldiers would go and take selfies at the respective ground zeros. I mean, they were living in the fallout zone. They were interacting with the fallout zone. It was a tricky thing for the U.S. government because on the one hand, they did want to downplay, the atrocity aspect of the bombing. But on the other hand, they wanted to upplay the fact that they had this incredibly destructive weapon, unprecedented weapon, and nobody else did, especially the Soviets. They really wanted the Soviet to know the full extent of their bombs. So in those early days, it was a constant tug of war of like, how much do we reveal and amp up about the destructiveness of the weapon and how much do we play down about how horrific it really is, again, in its aftermath.
And then along comes John Hersey, who was a correspondent for Time Life.
Yes. Well, initially, but he's freelance by the time he is reporting in Japan.
And then he took on this role for The New Yorker, which was originally a humor publication with a smaller readership. Why was he sort of the right person to get this done? I understand that there were clearances he had to get into Japan. How did he fit the criteria?
It was the right man in the right place at the right time. And, obviously luck always plays into these things, right? Who you're interacting with to get access to these places. And so, as you said, Hersey had been a war correspondent for a time and also wrote for Life through the war of 1939 forward. He'd seen many different theaters of combat. He'd seen concentration camps. He'd seen it all until the bombs came. And he knew when he first heard the reporting of the bombs, he was actually based in the States when he heard about Hiroshima. He knew that it was something totally different from what he had seen despite all of this exposure during the war. And he knew he was going to report on it. He just didn't know, in what capacity at that point. He's an interesting candidate because he had grown up in Asia. He had been the child of missionary parents. So he knew Asia, and he always was enough of an outsider, both within Asia and within America. That observer status, that outsider status is very handy for journalists. It makes him, again, just a very shrewd choice to go in. It means maybe he's never really buying in entirely to whatever side he's covering. That said, one thing that gave him a significant advantage is, during the war, he had done very flattering coverage of the U.S. military. He was a commended war hero. He had even, when he was in Asia, come under Japanese fire while he was embedded with a Marine unit, helped evacuate a wounded Marine and got a commendation.
When you were researching it, you had sort of first-person access to his notes, his first drafts. What did that kind of look like? How did it seem like he pieced it together?
First of all of his papers are at Yale at Beinecke's library. Well, it's interesting because Hersey was pretty reticent. I mean, he did not put himself into the public eye, but for somebody who was that reticent, he really did save everything. It was quite a paper trail for himself. So he knew what he had done was of historic significance, and that there would be people like me, that would eventually try to piece together the narrative of how he had told that story. It's worth saying that when he actually did get into Japan and get into Hiroshima, which he got access because he was seen as a team player with the U.S. military and not a threat, his approach was that he interviewed many survivor witnesses of the Hiroshima bombing, and then told the story of 6 regular everyday people, a mother, a priest, 2 doctors, their young children. So one of the things I wanted to find right away was his notes from those interviews. Those notes are not among his papers. I don't know where they are. He likely did take notes. His protagonist later said that he did, and he likely did them in shorthand because we know that he did learn shorthand when he was working for Sinclair Lewis and probably used them for reporting for years. I was also interested to know how well he had recounted the experience of the Japanese and one German victims. And some of them later said that he had recounted everything with extreme accuracy. So that was great. But there were a lot of other clues among his papers, scraps of paper that he had put with different contacts and different addresses and that sort of thing. And so I had a very strong research associate, and we were constantly piecing together, what could this address mean? Oh, what does he mean when he scribbled down on the back of this envelope, Radio Tokyo? Oh, that's where the Allied press corps had taken over and occupied that building and put out all their dispatches, that kind of thing. So it was a lot of assembling of a puzzle, which was, in my nerdy world, is like the most fun you could possibly have. And, he also had in his paper something that was incredibly helpful to me. And it was the handwritten and typewritten diary of one of his primary protagonists, Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, who detailed in excruciating detail what had happened on the day of and the days after and in the weeks and months after. And I became friends with his daughter, Koko Tanimoto, who's also in the book. And, between those 2 items, I was able to piece together, without simply just relying on Hersey's narrative, what had happened on that day in Hiroshima, the day of the bombing.
You mentioned Hersey liked to stay out of the spotlight. He was definitely a journalist, not a celebrity. But when his article was released, it sort of catapulted him into a level of fame maybe he wasn't anticipating. How was his perception publicly, just sort of around the world after its release?
As you say, I mean, he became a mega celebrity. There was some survey that came out. I can't remember who conducted it off the top of my head, but it was a service that puts out the top 10 celebrities of the year. And John Hersey's on it, along with like the biggest movie stars and political leaders around the world. And there he is. I think for Hersey, it was always a struggle. I don't think he craved visibility ever, but I think he did crave accomplishment and achievement. And then there's also the journalistic tension, too, of not being the center of your own story. And Hersey is really noticeably absent from his storytelling in Hiroshima, which is incredibly admirable because, in generations of journalists that follow, like Tom Wolfe and Norman Mailer, I mean, these guys are like in their stories. It's like, jazz hands in the center of their stories. Hersey was not that person. But I think actually that, his extreme fame that came out of Hiroshima, writing the story Hiroshima, really rattled him. He was always well connected. He was always well known. He was always well respected, but he wasn't a man about town in the way that subsequent journalists are going to be. He kind of went underground. He's predominantly known after that, or predominantly works on novels. He decides that storytelling can be done better through art, or make a bigger impact through art and through fictionalization than through nonfiction, which is the great irony of his career, because he remained best known for his reporting in Hiroshima forever afterwards. Nobody really knows his novels now. So I think in terms of how he was regarded around the world, look, I mean, he shocked the world with this revelation. He got the world to pay attention to an issue that nobody wanted to pay attention to. People were exhausted after the war. They didn't have any bandwidth for a mega atrocity story. It's a year later, they now have the attention span again. And then they were like, oh my God, this is actually what it really means to live in the atomic age. And it wasn't just for the worldwide audience, the revelation of what it had been like to be in Hiroshima. It was like the realization that this could happen to anybody, because guess what? Now you can attach nukes to missiles. So it was like the major wake-up call about what an existential threat it really had become. So obviously that's not going to be universally well regarded. It's unwelcome news, right? Whether you're in Ohio or Tokyo or London or wherever, it's like all of a sudden you're completely susceptible. So there's some kill the messenger, anger directed towards Hersey. But for the most part, most people, according to polls anyway, saw him as having done an enormous public service. People were grateful for the reporting. I mean, for some Americans, they felt that part of why they had fought the war was to help maintain freedom of information, the right to be informed. And Hersey's reporting had showed why that was so unbelievably important, because, I mean, who wants to be oblivious to the kinds of existential threats that are facing them? And Hersey had uncovered that particular threat and had uncovered the fact that there had been a cover-up surrounding it. So it was, there was both anger towards him, but also immense appreciation and respect directed towards him.
I like you mentioned that he kind of scooped the world, which he really did. It was obviously an international story.
It was amazing, the scoop, though, because it was low-lying fruit, wasn't it? Again, it was a huge, huge story, but nobody else had picked it up in the way that he had. People had moved on. Journalists had moved on from that story. They literally called Hiroshima just a couple of months later. It's an old story. Nobody wants to hear about it anymore. And, Hersey and his editors are like, well, actually, no, nobody has covered it properly. And that's the thing. So you get this frenzy of initial coverage, and the press corps moves on, and it takes somebody like Hersey to come in and scoop the world. And because you see that actually the real story or the full story hasn't been told yet, and we're going to tell it, whether we end up having an audience for it or not. And they really had the audience.
You mentioned that some of your research I saw was actually in Russian because there was such an impact as the world moved into the Cold War and the Soviets were trying to militarize their nuclear arsenal. Can you talk a bit about just Hiroshima's impact on nuclear powers and sort of the tensions that created?
Yes, to start at the beginning of the question, part of the research was done in Russian, not by me. I don't speak or read Russian, but I had, a really powerful research associate who was my Russian translator and co-researcher. And through some papers at the New York Public Library, I learned that, Russia was not that psyched about Hersey's Hiroshima. for different reasons than the U.S. wasn't psyched. The U.S. isn't psyched because, it deprives them of moral high ground, right? Russia's not psyched because Hersey's Hiroshima very painfully demonstrates the power of a weapon that the U.S. has, but the Soviets don't. They don't want their populations to read Hersey's report for different reasons. They don't want them to get alarmed. They don't want them to see the Soviets as being at a disadvantage. So they actually send their own propagandistic reporter to Nagasaki, who then writes a counter story where he basically says that John Hersey made everything up and that, the nuclear threat is a total American fake and Hersey's a spy and all this stuff. I mean, it was shocking. You could debate Hersey's role in the nuclear landscape since the story came out. You could debate that role to the end of days. I mean, some people think that he played including him, he thought he played quite an important role in deterrence. Not necessarily him personally, but the testimonies that he secured. He said that one of the things that has kept the world safe from subsequent nuclear attack is the memory of what happened at Hiroshima. Now, he's the one who documented the most lasting testimonies, the most still constantly read testimonies of what happened in Hiroshima. And in that sense, his article turned book really contributed to what we call today the nuclear taboo. It made it a lot harder for leaders to just reach for the nuclear weapons as part of a regular arsenal and use them in a sort of a more cavalier, casual way. Whereas if people really didn't have that strong a sense of what it had been like to be on the receiving end of nuclear warfare, we probably would have seen uses of nuclear weapons in the conflict since. I mean, obviously that's being really challenged right now in the Ukraine war. Many experts are incredibly worried that the nuclear taboo may be over, that Putin doesn't care about the nuclear taboo, that the message of Hiroshima is not effective as a deterrent right now, or may not be effective. And this is the first time since World War II that these are really palpable, urgent concerns. So we'll see. I mean, this is the testing moment that Hersey feared, that nuclear experts since have feared. This is it. This is the moment that we've been leading up to.
Do you think since Hersey's story came out, journalism has changed in its ability to impact memory? Is that part of the reason the taboo is fading, because journalism as a whole has changed, or has it just been too much time?
It's a really complicated question. Journalism has changed a lot, but it still does have the ability to make an incredibly powerful impact. But also people are picking and choosing their facts right now in a way that's incredibly scary. And that's its own existential threat, the ability to opt into misinformation. But we have seen in recent years the ability of journalism to create enormous social movements. So for instance, like Me Too reporting, the initial reporting on Harvey Weinstein, which, completely gave rise to the Me Too movement and has changed. Well, I mean, we'll see how much it's changed, but it's definitely created an enormous historic moment. But, at the same time, like the idea that an article could come out in the New Yorker now and change the world the way that Hersey's story changed the world. I mean, I don't know if it would have the same impact. It could, but I think the media universe is really atomized considerably. So, people are reading very different sources of information. I would say that the biggest challenge really in terms of the media landscape, misinformation and combating it.
That's because there's so much information right now versus before it was kind of more like, what is the government releasing? You think now it's because there's just so much news and people are choosing what they want to believe?
I think that's because there's so many different news sources right now. And I think that also there's just an enormous amount of disinformation that's being put out by really powerful news organizations, both central and fringe. And people are self-curating their information in a way that they just didn't, at least to this extent, in the immediate post-war environment. But, that said, I mean, there's always going to be the obligation of journalists who have the platform that Hersey had to report to the best of their abilities. And if you're sitting on a story like Hersey was sitting on, to get it out there, no matter what. And, at least in the time of this interview, we still have incredibly powerful legacy publications that can make a huge impact. Like if you publish a report like that in the New York Times, which is still, whether you like it or not, the paper of record, you can have some pretty thunderous impact. Like you'll definitely get a message across. Whether it ends up impacting policy is a totally different thing. And you might also, even if you're reporting, even if like, let's say you're getting to 90% of the American population through a report that comes out in the Times, you still have to steel yourself for the fact that 30% of the population may reflexively just dismiss it as quote unquote fake news.
I just wanted to touch on your research a bit more. You mentioned that the book could have been 1,000 pages, but you ended up cutting it down to where it's at now. If there's anything, like, is there anything that sticks out to you that didn't end up making it that you would have liked in it?
Look, my first draft was like bananas long. And, my editor, who is vicious and cruel, but I love him, really was very, very fierce and stern about it. His whole thing is about a propulsive narrative. And, you can't deliver information to your readers unless they're really engaged with what they read. And so it has to be consuming. And I really have learned a lot from him over the 2 books that we've done together about how unbelievably important that was. And, so as painful as it is to make cuts, I really now believe that it was completely in service of the bigger mission of the book. And when you're publicizing a book like Fallout, and I'm also a journalist as well as a book historian, and there's the opportunity to write about in articles and other formats the stuff that you left on the cutting room floor. So that stuff never doesn't get used, and it always informs the narrative, even when it's not blatantly stated in the book. My first book was about Ernest Hemingway, and his then revolutionary approach to both fiction and nonfiction alike is what he calls the tip of the iceberg, where you're just revealing a little bit of what but there's a mammoth body underneath the water, and in this case, a mammoth amount of research and facts that didn't get onto the final page, but they still inform the feeling of the book. So it took me a while and quite a bit of struggle to get to the point where I would feel comfortable with sacrificing that much in service of the narrative. But now it is the kind of writer that I am, and I will never be what we call the completest academic writer again.
What was it like for you as a journalist getting to go kind of retrace his steps, go to Hiroshima? You met one of his main characters, right? How did that impact you as a person? Did you feel you came out differently?
Yeah, look, going to Hiroshima was really, I don't want to say life-changing, but it was, Hiroshima for me is like one of the most psychically disturbing places I've ever been. And, it's a vibrant, rebuilt city. When I was there a few years ago, it was, 3 million people in the prefecture, so it looks, if you walked in there, you would, and you didn't know the history, because I don't know how you wouldn't know the history, but you would have no idea that it had been the site of nuclear holocaust. There are Starbucks, McDonald's. It's like very well serviced by American industry. I'll definitely say that. It's hotels. They have like a baseball team that everybody's really psyched about. It's regular life. You see school kids in your uniforms going to school, and parents with briefcases, and it's like a regular city. But for me, because I really do know what happened there, it's like I didn't eat and drink practically or sleep the whole time that I was there, because I just couldn't. It was just you know what's in the ground there, and what happened there. And I interviewed the governor of Hiroshima Prefecture, who's based in the city, and he said one of the first things he said in our interview is it's a graveyard. It's never been properly excavated. So all of this that you see built here, whenever we build a new development, you dig a few feet and there are bones. So it's literally built on the bones of people who died in that nuclear attack. And it was, really harrowing. And, despite the fact that it's been rebuilt to a certain extent, there are still parts of it that are, they've left a couple of structures that were partly destroyed by the bombing, so people could see what it was like. And there's also a sort of a manicured, beautiful Japanese garden that had been a destination for survivors who had like dragged themselves out of the city. I won't describe in this podcast what it had looked like in those moments, but when I walked through it, it was a beauty. Like people took wedding pictures there again. But then you walk in a little bit and there's a plaque that says, oh, by the way, in the 1980s, when we planted this, we found 80 bodies. There's no place in the city that's not a graveyard. So it was a horrible and difficult experience to go. But it was also extremely necessary. Like, you can't write this book without going there. So I did.
Well, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate your account and I don't know, taking the time to put this story together. It's an important story for people to know, I think.
Well, I'm really glad that you read it, and thank you for highlighting it on your podcast. And, I really hope that people your age read Hersey's work, because there has to be an awareness of this. I mean, look, Ukraine has changed everything. Everybody's aware of the nuclear threat again. But 2 months ago, we were having this conversation. I would have been saying there has to be more awareness of the nuclear existential threat among your generation, because right now it's being ignored and it's going to pop up and everybody's going to not know what to do. Well, lo and behold, that's where it is right now. But I think if we come out of Ukraine unscathed by any nuclear issues, the more people your age who remain re-engaged with the issue again, the more it becomes a political issue, and the more we have, better policies directed towards containing the nuclear threat. So thanks for reading it.
Absolutely. Tune in to the next episode of the Sperber Prize podcast for my conversation with Ira Rosen about his book Ticking Clock, Behind the Scenes at 60 Minutes. Special thanks to our guest Lesley Blume, Fordham University, and the Sperber Prize Committee for making this show possible. For more information about the Sperber Prize, you can visit our website at sperberprize.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon.